What is going on, Headliner Nation? Jake, Fantasy Headliners. Hopefully everybody's doing well out there. Today we talk about our Week 15 running backs. Who are we starting and who are we sitting? It's a critical week, right? Fantasy playoffs for so many people out there this week. And some of the guys who have let us down over the past few weeks are starting to make a little bit of a bounce back. Can they carry us through the fantasy playoffs? That's what we're going to talk about today, and we're going to go through every matchup. But first, before we get into Week 15, let's take a look back at Week 14 and see how we did. And it was one of my best weeks of the entire season last week. Out of the 70 running backs that we gave a start or sit designation to last week, 61 of them were correct for an accuracy percentage of 87%. Some of the biggest misses, Miles Sanders. We didn't know what this offense in Philadelphia would look like with Jalen Hurts. Well, now we have, and we'll talk about it here in just a few minutes. Liked what we saw from Miles Sanders, even though it was really just one big, huge run that gave him that big day. Gus Edwards stole a couple touchdowns there from J.K. Dobbins, and Aaron Jones continues to disappoint on again, off again here throughout the second half of the season. Some of the bigger hits were going all rookie this past week. Cam Akers, Jonathan Taylor, J.K. Dobbins, a bunch of rookies producing late in the season, and that's what we'd love to see here for our fantasy football teams. But can they do it again in Week 15? We got games all over the place this week. Thursday night, we got Saturday, Sunday, Monday, a lot of football here coming up over the next few days. We need to make sure all of our lineups are set in time. Don't forget about those Saturday games here this week. But now, let's head into Week 15. Let's kick it off with the Thursday night football matchup between the Los Angeles Chargers and Las Vegas Raiders, and that's the Austin Ekeler that we want to see, right? We saw him last week finish inside the top 10 once again, and that's what's really going to help us down the stretch. It's great to have Austin Ekeler in that type of role on a weekly basis. He now has 34 targets combined over his last 3 games. That's huge volume in the passing game, and that's what gives him that safe floor. That's really where he excels. He's averaging right around 20 total touches a game, and now he gets a matchup going up against the Raiders, who allow over 23 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, third most in the NFL. He's back to being the guy in this backfield, right? He's a weekly must-start. Not much to really talk about there in the backfield for the Los Angeles Chargers outside of Austin Ekeler. What about on the Vegas Raiders side of things and Josh Jacobs? We knew he wasn't going to be 100%. He was questionable about whether or not he was even going to play. And then he decided to troll the fantasy community by saying he wasn't going to play after he was listed as active, and then gave the middle finger emoji saying he doesn't really care about your fantasy football team. Well, little does he know, the joke's on him, because his post there on Instagram probably had a few people wondering whether they should start him or not, and they removed him from their lineup. Well, you saved yourself from scoring only 7.5 fantasy points from Josh Jacobs, because he kind of laid an egg. He looked healthy for the most part. I do expect him to play here in Week 15. We do need to monitor the practice reports throughout the week, though, just to see how things go. If he's back to a full go by end of the week, or before the Thursday game, he's definitely somebody who goes right back into your lineup as a mid, I'd say running back 2 or so this week, mid to high end running back 2 here this week, going up against the Chargers. They allow right around 17.5 fantasy points per game. Do we see a little Devontae Booker sprinkled in? Probably, but honestly, he's kind of just struggled here as of late. Josh Jacobs has, just due to the injury he suffered in Week 12. Once he gets back to full health, he's a weekly must-start. We all know that. He's still in the top 10 overall running backs for the season. Like I said, he's a solid running back 2 here for you in Week 15. Now we move on to Saturday football. First game up, Buffalo Bills, Denver Broncos. We got 2 backfields, 2 committees, and a whole lot of question marks, right? Plus, we have 2 defenses that allow right around 18 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. The problem is, both these teams give at least 2 running backs on their roster over 10 touches a week. I mean, it really makes them touchdown dependent, because there's not one guy getting the bulk of the volume every single week. The biggest issue, though, is the touchdowns just aren't there. These 4 guys, we got Melvin Gordon, Phillip Lindsay, Zach Moss, Devin Singletary, have combined for a total of 6 touchdowns over the last 7 weeks between all 4 of them. So we're not really chasing a whole lot of touchdown upside no matter which way we go. Now, over the last month, they have 2 combined finishes inside the top 15 between all 4 players. Both times, it was Melvin Gordon. Right now, he's scored over 11 fantasy points in 3 out of his last 4 games played. And out of this entire group of running backs, as of right now, he's the only guy I'm considering to start here in Week 15. Second game on Saturday is going to be the Carolina Panthers and Green Bay Packers, and at this point, just plan on no Christian McCaffrey. Matt Rule has already come out and said, yeah, he's pretty much doubtful to play this week, and I honestly totally understand it. Why are they going to put him out there? They really have nothing to play for, but like I said, don't count on him rest of the season. That way, if he does play, you're pleasantly surprised instead of being disappointed on a weekly basis. So we go back to talking once again about Mike Davis, who finished back inside the top 5 this past week. He had 93 total yards and found the end zone twice, which was great for fantasy owners who plugged him in there last minute. Now he gets a matchup going up against the Green Bay Packers, who allow over 23 fantasy points per game, which is 4th most in the NFL. Green Bay just allowed 2 rushing touchdowns last week to the Detroit Lions, but we really need him to be involved in the passing game, right? We need Mike Davis to get close to 8 targets. If he can get close to 8 targets in this ball game, plus the upside and the touchdown upside on the ground against Green Bay, we could be looking at another top 10 finish for Mike Davis. He's going to be a start for me this week as well. For Green Bay, the up and down roller coaster of Aaron Jones just continues here, second half of the season. He has now finished outside of the top 20 running backs 4 of the last 6 games played. But you can't ever afford to really sit him, right? He can literally win your matchup almost by himself on a weekly basis. A matchup this week going up against the Carolina Panthers, which gives up right around 19 fantasy points per game, which is 9th most in the NFL. We could be looking at a big game from Aaron Jones, but we thought that last week in a great matchup and did not get it. You're starting Aaron Jones. Yes, he's still splitting touches in this backfield with Jamal Williams. Jamal Williams being a little bit less efficient. We really need Aaron Jones to find the end zone. That's where the money's at for his stats here in fantasy football. And when he doesn't find it, more times than not, you're kind of disappointed with his production. But as of right now, can't afford to sit him. Still starting Aaron Jones. So now we finally get to Sunday football, San Francisco 49ers, Dallas Cowboys, and we may be without Raheem Mostert here once again. He had an MRI on his ankle. We're awaiting all the results to find out how much time, if any, he's going to miss. But as of right now, I'm planning on no Raheem Mostert here in Week 15, which means a whole lot more Jeff Wilson Jr., who's already been involved in this backfield, right? He's seen 10-plus touches for 3 straight games. So even with Mostert healthy, Jeff Wilson Jr. has been a part of this backfield. And now, potentially with no Mostert in the lineup, he gets the Dallas Cowboys defense, who allows over 20 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Yeah, I actually like me some Jeff Wilson Jr. here this week, but here's the beauty of it. He's not a must-start running back 2 or running back 1 for your team, more than likely, which means you can throw this guy in a flex spot, and the potential ceiling he could have could really help win your matchups here in the fantasy playoffs. For Dallas, you got Ezekiel Elliott, and yes, he's been a disappointment, but you can tell he's not 100% healthy. He only had 1 more touch this past week than Tony Pollard. Can we really afford to sit Zeke, though? I mean, you really can't, right? Look at Miles Sanders. Look what happened last week with Miles Sanders. Zeke can do the exact same thing. He can go out there and have a huge game. Do you want it to happen in your fantasy playoffs on your bench? This really depends on 2 things. 1, the health of Ezekiel Elliott, right? If he's limited all week long, you start to take a look at your roster to see what other options you may have. If he's a full practice participant and 100% healthy, I have a hard time sitting him. It is a difficult matchup going up against San Francisco, the 8th best fantasy defense against opposing running backs. Not the greatest of matchups for a struggling Zeke as is, but this really depends on health and other options on your team. As of right now, he's a start. But depending on how this week goes, he could move towards that sit column. He's getting dangerously close to crossing that line. On to Seattle and Washington, fairly simple for Seattle, right? As long as Chris Carson is healthy, he's a start for us every single week, but he hasn't really been getting huge volume, right? He hasn't had more than 16 touches in a game since week 4. Yet, over the last 3 games he's played, which coming back after injury, those 3 games, he's averaging 16 fantasy points per game, has had a touchdown in 3 straight games, and is running back 8 overall during that time frame. Sounds good to me, right? Perfect timing. Even though you missed him for majority of the season, you're getting him at the right time. Plus, a matchup here against the Redskins isn't the greatest. They're allowing right around 15 fantasy points per game, but it's Chris Carson and the Seattle Seahawks offense. They utilize him great on a weekly basis, and with that passing work, it gives them the safer floor. We're going to start Chris Carson here for Seattle. What about Antonio Gibson and the Washington football team? I mean, it doesn't sound like we're going to have Antonio Gibson once again. I mean, with turf toe, usually that's something that takes multiple weeks to recover from. But they do need him, right? They need him back at some point if they can get him. Right now, they're the division leader at 6-7. they're fighting for a playoff chance at 6-7. Having Antonio Gibson could be a huge help, but I'm not banking on it here in Week 15. It's likely we see a lot more Peyton Barber and J.D. McKissic once again. The problem here is I like J.D. McKissic, especially in PPR leagues, but he's tied to Alex Smith, and when Alex Smith went down last week, that hurt J.D. McKissic because we know Alex Smith likes to check down. Now, as of right now, Washington is very optimistic that Alex Smith is going to come back and play this week. If he does, I will start J.D. McKissic here once again in PPR league. Seattle allows right around 18 fantasy points per game. J.D.'s the only guy I'm really interested in as long as Alex Smith is the guy under center. Bears and Vikings, and David Montgomery continues his end-of-season tear, right? He now has 3 straight finishes inside the top 7 overall running backs, 4 touchdowns over his last 3 games played, and has 2 100-yard games over that same time frame. Going up against Minnesota, who allows right around 17.5 fantasy points per game, this is a definite, start once again for David Montgomery. It's really helping him with Mitch Trubisky under center because Mitch can open up the passing game. What happens when you open up the passing game? Defenders have to pull out of the box, and that just opens more running lanes for David Montgomery. He's not really splitting touches with anybody at this time. You got to ride the hot hand and continue to start David Montgomery. For Minnesota, no question, right? You're going to start Dalvin Cook every single week. But yes, this is one of those weeks where his ceiling maybe a little bit lower. He just faced off against this same Bears defense back in Week 10, finished as running back 16. He didn't have any touchdowns in that game, but did have 112 total yards. But you just don't ever sit Dalvin Cook. He can break a big play and find the end zone at any given time. He's going to remain a start here once again this week. Patriots and Dolphins, and not a lot to love here on either side of the football. Sounds like no Myles Gaskin once again. Don't forget, he was added to the COVID IR late last week on Saturday, so more than likely he won't be cleared in time to play this week, which means more DeAndre Washington, more Patrick Laird, more ineffectiveness in the backfield, right? They didn't do much of anything against Kansas City. I would love it if Salvon Ahmed would come back, but he's still hurt. He's still banged up. Still unclear whether or not he's even going to play or not. And going up against the Patriots, they allow around 18 fantasy points per game. But with the split in this backfield, the ineffective split in this backfield, I just prefer to sit all of them if possible. If you're absolutely desperate and you absolutely need somebody, I'll go DeAndre Washington and just chase the volume. But that's about it. For New England, it's the same old, right? You got 3 running backs who are all getting touches. You got Cam Newton, who's going to steal goal line touchdowns. You have a Miami D, which is much improved. If you watched any of that game last week against Kansas City at times on the ground, they were dominant against Kansas City, shutting down CEH and Le'Veon Bell at times. There's just too many questions, though, in this backfield, right? Who's it going to be? Is it going to be James White? Is it going to be Damian Harris? Is Sony Michel going to get the bulk of the touches? We just don't know on a weekly basis. And once you take the bulk of those touchdowns out of the equation and give them to Cam Newton, I prefer to sit all these guys as well. Jags and Ravens, and can we please free J.K. Dobbins at this point? He's going to be my Manscaped must-start of the week. Just a quick reminder, after this video is over, head over to manscaped.com and use promo code HEADLINERS, all caps at checkout. Get 20% off your order and free shipping. Christmas is right around the corner. Get yourself a present. Get somebody else a present before it's too late. Head over there as soon as this video is over. But now let's get back to J.K. Dobbins because this dude has touchdowns in 3 straight games. He's averaging almost 5 yards per carry over that span. The biggest issue really, is Gus Edwards to an extent stealing touchdowns, right? It's really taking away from the ceiling of J.K. Dobbins, but it's Lamar Jackson finally, utilizing that running game a little bit more. We're seeing Lamar get more mobile over the past few weeks, and that's opening up running lanes all over the place for J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards. That's fine. This backfield can support 2 fantasy assets, and J.K. Dobbins, the more electric of the 2. Unfortunately, we see Gus Edwards right around the end zone a little bit too much, but the ceiling is still climbing on a weekly basis for J.K. Dobbins. He's going to be a start. If you're in a deeper league looking for a flex play this week, I don't mind Gus Edwards either. The Jags allow over 23 fantasy points per game, and the Baltimore Ravens run offense is finally starting to get going. I'll start both of these guys if needed, J.K. Dobbins being the higher of the 2. For James Robinson in Jacksonville, a little bit of a down week in Week 14, but you really can't sit James Robinson at this point. Yeah, that week was a little down last week, but it's because he had a touchdown called back also. Don't forget about that. He's still getting the looks in this offense in the passing game around the goal line. We now got Gardner Minshew back under center. He's going to check down at times to James Robinson. That consistent pass work gives him that safe floor. Plus, the Baltimore run defense just got killed by Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt. Now, am I saying that the offensive line of Jacksonville and James Robinson is comparable to the offensive line of Cleveland and Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb? No, I'm really not. They're night and day. However, James Robinson has been producing behind this line against tough opponents all year long, and we're not stopping it now. I'm still starting James Robinson. Bucks and Falcons, and it sounds like Ronald Jones is having pinky finger surgery, which is not ideal at this time of the fantasy season because is he going to play this week? This is basically the same surgery that Chris Godwin had a few weeks ago, and he missed 1 week because of it. Does Ronald Jones miss this week? It's entirely possible, and that makes this really tough then, right? Leonard Fournette last week, a healthy scratch. LaShawn McCoy, a shell of his old self. Keyshawn Vaughn, an unproven rookie. I mean, now they get a matchup against the Atlanta Falcons, the 6th best run defense against opposing running backs, allowing only 14.5 fantasy points per game. I mean, this sounds like a recipe for stress and male pattern baldness during the fantasy playoffs. As of right now, I prefer to sit all of these guys. Now, if word comes out late in the week that Ronald Jones is a full go, that he's going to play, I'll consider starting Ronald Jones, but that's it. If he's limited throughout the week, if there's question marks surrounding it, I just prefer to sit this entire backfield at this point. For the Falcons and Todd Gurley, I mean, I sat Todd Gurley last week, and I'm going to do it again this week, especially against this defense of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I mean, Todd Gurley hasn't finished inside the top 45 running backs since week 9. He hasn't even had more than 10 touches in a game since week 9. I mean, it may be all over for Todd Gurley at this point. He's going to be a sit this week in a very difficult matchup on a team who really isn't utilizing him much right now, and the touchdown upside that he had to start the season is almost all but gone at this point. Detroit and Tennessee, and oh my lord, we get a Derrick Henry matchup against the Detroit Lions in the fantasy playoffs. Oh, yeah, that's an amazing matchup here this week for Derrick Henry owners. This guy just ran for 215 yards and 2 touchdowns last week and has scored at least 30 fantasy points in 2 out of his last 3 games played. Yeah, you're going to continue to start Derrick Henry, no questions asked. Could be a huge game once again for Detroit. It was great to see DeAndre Swift back this past week, right? He led the backfield in Detroit in almost every single category once again. However, he was kind of eased back in, right? We didn't see huge volume from DeAndre Swift there last week, but I expect that volume to increase once again this week. Going up against Tennessee, they allow the 7th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. We're primed for another good game here from DeAndre Swift. He's going right back in to the start column. Texans, Colts, and some of that excitement that I just had for Derrick Henry, I got a little bit of that for Jonathan Taylor too this week going up against the Houston Texans. I mean, this guy has now finished inside the top 15 3 straight weeks. He's gone over 100 total yards in 3 straight games and has finally taken over this backfield, playing with a lot more confidence, right? And now a matchup against the Houston Texans who allow over 26 fantasy points per game, 2nd most in the NFL. Absolutely starting Jonathan Taylor here this week. Nyheim Hines still seems to be that second option in Indianapolis. If you're in a larger league, a PPR league, he is a solid, flex play if you're looking for somebody there in one of those deeper leagues. For Houston, does David Johnson return from the COVID IR this week? It sounds possible. Sounds pretty likely that we could have him, but what can we really expect from him if he does return? Going up against the Indianapolis Colts, a solid defense against opposing running backs. And over the last 6 weeks of the NFL season, David Johnson has a total of 12 touches for 60 yards and 1 touchdown. He's missed a lot of time. Is this one of those games where they kind of just ease him back in once again? Kind of similar to what we saw last week with DeAndre Swift. More of a split with Duke Johnson this week in a difficult matchup. I prefer to sit David Johnson here in Week 15. Battle of the Birds now, and we got the Philadelphia Eagles, Arizona Cardinals. I've never been so glad to have been wrong, right? Miles Sanders was a miss for me last week, and I'm not even mad about it because we finally saw what he could do in this offense, and they put him in a great position, right? The read option with Jalen Hurts could really bump up the fantasy production of Miles Sanders here a lot to end the season, right? The Eagles trying to still win football games. They need Miles Sanders. They need those big plays. Those big plays that we saw last week from Miles Sanders could be something we could see a little bit more on a regular basis with Jalen Hurts under center. And a matchup this week going up against the Arizona Cardinals who allow around 18 fantasy points per game. I mean, we saw the big play potential. Not much of a split in this backfield. No cute play calling. They got Miles Sanders the ball, and he did something with it. going to have to start him here this week against the Cardinals. For Arizona, the Drake train continues here, second half of the season. Now 4 straight games with a touchdown and has at least 13 fantasy points in all 4 of those games as well. He's coming off a season high in carries with 23 carries on the ground, which we love to see. It is a stingy Philly defense there on the ground, but the way that Drake has been playing in this offense and how they've been featuring him on a weekly basis, you can't afford to sit that type of volume and that type of touchdown upside. He's a solid running back too in the start here in week 15. Jets and Rams, and my tail's starting to wag again, and this time for Cam Akers to go against the New York Jets. Yes, please. Finally, we had him listed as a start last week. We expected the breakout, and it actually happened. All this kid has needed all year long is volume. He's been splitting with Darrell Henderson and Malcolm Brown, and this guy is the best back in this backfield, hands down. Well, he got 31 total touches last week, which he turned in to almost 200 total yards, and has hopefully by now proven that this should be his job outright in a matchup this week against the Jets, who allow over 18 fantasy points per game. Like I said, all this kid needed was the chance and the volume. He got it, he capitalized on it, and going forward, we're going to have to start him weekly until they give us a reason not to. For the Jets, I'd rather have the Herp as of right now than start a Jet running back in the fantasy playoffs. Now, I understand there's some deep leagues out there, and you may be struggling for a choice. Who's it going to be? Honestly, I don't want either. If I had to take a stab, I guess I go Frank Gore, but I don't love it. I don't want to do it. They barely have a lead ever. They can barely ever dedicate anything to the running game. There's no touchdown upside. The split and touches, no, pass. Chiefs and Saints now, and raise your hand out there on YouTube land if you're just completely over the Kansas City backfield at this point. I mean, Le'Veon Bell, non-existent, right? 4 carries last week. Yeah, he's not involved. What about CEH? Well, he's barely averaging 3 yards per carry over his last 5 games played. The whole crowd that, was out there preseason that said, oh man, CEH is going to be a top 10 back because of the touchdown upside on a weekly basis. That's all he needs is just that touchdown upside. I haven't heard from that crowd in forever because CEH has only 5 total touchdowns on the season. And it's because Kansas City just wants to throw the ball. But why wouldn't they? I mean, they do it pretty dang well, and it's working for them, so why not continue to do it? Nobody can really stop it. And now they get a matchup going up against the New Orleans Saints, the number 1 rushing defense in fantasy football, allowing only 13 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and that number would be even lower if it wasn't for the 82-yard rushing touchdown of Miles Sanders last week on a missed tackle. Yes, that number could be even lower. They're a great run defense, and there's a lot of question marks in this backfield. The one little sliver of hope, I guess you could say, is the passing upside, the pass catching ability of CEH. That's what makes him a weekly start. His ceiling is there, right? We've seen his ceiling before. We just don't see it very often. But the pass catching ability gives him the safer floor of right around 8 to 10 fantasy points on a weekly basis. He's more of a flex play at this point, but he's still a start for New Orleans. The Kamara owners out there, they're feeling a lot better, right? For a while there, they were having to be watched very closely because their sphincters had tightened up so fast. They could barely breathe at that point. But now he has back-to-back top 12 finishes. 10 targets he saw in week 14, which is absolutely great. Has back-to-back games with a touchdown, and he's getting more and more involved with this offense with Taysom Hill under center, which is a great thing to see. Now a matchup going up against Kansas City. They'll have around 18 fantasy points per game. Time to fire up Alvin Kamara on a weekly basis once again, and maybe not worry as much as you were just a few weeks ago. Browns and Giants, and over here, we love the Chubb, right? The dude is 6 points away from being inside the top 12 overall running backs for the season, and he missed 4 games on the year. That's how great he's been playing. Now, sure, it could be even more, right? Without Kareem Hunt, I get that, but they are coexisting just fine. Both Chubb and Hunt finished inside the top 10 running backs last week, and now a matchup against the Giants, who allow the 10th most fantasy points to opposing running backs at almost 20 fantasy points per game. Don't overthink this one. Both Chubb and Hunt going to be starts here once again for New York. Yeah, Wayne Gallman kind of came crashing back down to earth in week 14, right? It was his first game since week 6 in which he didn't have a touchdown or 100 total yards, but they were trailing pretty big to Arizona. They couldn't commit the touches on the ground to Wayne Gallman, so I totally understand. The guy just didn't, start sucking at football, just didn't get the opportunities that we've seen him have in weeks past, but Cleveland's been playing pretty good as of late, right? Baker's throwing the ball down the field. He looks better. The running game is going. it's still going to be a start for Wayne Gallman. We saw Baltimore effectively move the ball on the ground once again against Cleveland, and I get it. They're better running the ball than the Giants are, but they can dedicate more touches as long as they can keep this game close. I'm looking for the Giants defense to kind of show up in this game, keep this game close, and allow Wayne Gallman to get closer to 18 touches this week, because if he does, you'll be fine with him as a flex start in your lineups here in Week 15. Which leaves us Monday Night Football, Pittsburgh Steelers, Cincinnati Bengals, and I haven't started a Cincinnati running back in weeks. And it's not changing this week either, not against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Gio Bernard has all but disappeared in this backfield. Samaje Perine, do you want to start him? No, I didn't think so either. Bad quarterback play at times is just closing down all those running lanes. We're not starting any of these guys in Cincinnati. But for Pittsburgh, what about James Conner? Is he pulling his own Gio Bernard impression? 10 carries for 18 yards against Buffalo last week. He hasn't finished inside the top 15 since week 8. Now, it's a decent matchup going up against Cincinnati. They allow 19 fantasy points per game, 8th most in the NFL. He's going to be more of a flex start at this point, though. James Conner not going to be within my top 24, probably going to be closer to that 30 to 26 to 30 range in my rankings here this week. The floor has just gotten super low for James Conner, and it's a lot more risky to start him on a weekly basis. They're just throwing the ball way too much in Pittsburgh to really dedicate more touches on the ground to James Conner. Now, I have him as a start, but I'm not against sitting him if you have better options. You've been without him a lot this season. Maybe you were able to pick up a better option that we've talked about in this episode. Make sure you stay tuned to our rankings episode later in the week, because you may have a better option than James Conner. If not, a flex play at best for me here in Week 15. All right, those are my starts and sits for Week 15 fantasy football. With the fantasy playoffs here, we want to make sure we wish you guys all the best of luck and try to win as many fantasy football championships as we possibly can here for Headliner Nation. Just a quick reminder once again. There is no live show scheduled for this week, but we will continue to have all of our start-sit episodes and all of our rankings episodes, our injury report videos, our DFS content, all that stuff still coming on a weekly basis here on this channel. So make sure you stay tuned later in the week. As things change in the NFL, that's our opportunity to give you those updated changes. So make sure you stay tuned to both. We greatly appreciate the support out there. Hopefully you guys have a great week. Happy holidays, and we'll talk to you later.